There is a quiet departure that has been taking place for more than a decade, one that hardly registered on the cultural radar because it lacked drama. No slammed doors, no shouting matches, no dramatic farewells. The good men simply stopped showing up. They stopped initiating, stopped spending, stopped chasing, and by the time anyone looked up, the room was already empty. A 2026 survey of more than 5,000 single adults found that only about 30% were actively dating. Roughly 3 out of 4 women had not been on a date in the last year. That is not a shortage of good men. That is a market where the buyers have stopped coming. The men have been signaling why for over a decade. In the app data, the debt numbers, the loneliness statistics, and the earnings reports of companies built on male desperation. None of this happened in secret. The evidence has been public, but it required someone to connect the dots. This is the timeline of exactly when the good men checked out, what they were doing instead, and what the market looks like now for those who are just discovering that it had an expiration date. By the end of this breakdown, any man will understand why the men who had options were the first to walk, and why almost none of this happened accidentally. The first reason, and the one men cite before any other, is the effort to reward ratio. The average man spends about $68 on a date, which is roughly 20% more than the average woman spends. The same research shows that it takes approximately 7 dates before an interaction turns into a standing couple. That comes to about $700 just to find out if someone is going to stay. And that is assuming every date leads to the next one, which it rarely does. Here is a number that should stop anyone cold. 21% of men have gone into debt from dating. For women, that number is 9%. Men are more than twice as likely to incur financial debt simply trying to participate in a market that rejects them most of the time. He did not get bitter. He opened a calculator. When the cost of staying in a game is higher than the expected reward, leaving is the rational move. That is not giving up. That is exit behavior, the most logical thing a person can do in a losing equation. The math only broke because his odds were already terrible. And those odds were not random either. The second reason is the invisible majority, which explains why his odds were so bad in the first place. In 2017, an engineer from Hinge ran the numbers on how likes actually move on that platform. Not a podcaster, not a commentator, but an engineer with all the data in front of him. Half of every like sent to men went to the top 15% of men. The top 1% of men pulled more than 16% of all likes on the entire app. The men in the bottom half of the platform were fighting for scraps. And this was not even new. OkCupid published almost the same picture back in 2009 on their own blog before they quietly took it down. Women on the site rated 80% of men as below average looking. 80% below average. Think about what that does to the word average. If 80% of people fall below it, that word means nothing. What is really being said is that the majority of men are invisible. That data from 2009 and 2017 sat in plain sight for over a decade. Meanwhile, the market just kept getting worse. Now, this is where the lazy part of the argument must be addressed. No one is saying women are wrong for having preferences. Everyone has preferences. That is not the problem. The problem is what the machine did with those preferences. These apps never showed women the real market. They showed them the top 10 or 15% on a loop, the most polished profiles they had. As a consequence, an entire generation quietly recalibrated what was normal to the top of the distribution. These men did not get rejected. They simply got erased. The psychologist Carl Jung observed that we do not see things as they are. We see things as we are. When the feedback a man receives is silence year after year, eventually he believes the silence and he leaves. That is the invisible majority of men. The third reason is rejection, exhaustion, and this one is not about money at all. It is about repetition. Men describe it the same way over and over. It is never one big rejection. It is 1,000 small silences. The match that never actually says anything. The conversation that dies at hello. The date that goes well and then nothing. Or they plan an entire date and get ghosted the day of no reply, no reason. There is a name for what that does, and it is well documented: learned helplessness. When an animal or a person receives enough outcomes they cannot control, they stop trying. Even after the situation changes and trying again might actually work, it is too late. Many women respond to this as if it is just male weakness. It is not. It is a documented response to an environment where effort and reward have been severed from each other. The man's version of that response is simple. He stopped sitting at a table where the food never comes. More exit behavior and the same cold logic underneath it. The fourth reason is that the alternative became competitive. The assumption under almost every conversation about the dating market is that men who leave must be miserable, lonely, depressed. That if a man stops pursuing relationships, something must be wrong with him because she is obviously the prize. But that is not exactly what happened. What if he compared the two options in front of him and preferred the second one? For most of human history, the alternative to relationships was isolation. But today, that alternative can be a full life. Friends, purpose, travel, entertainment, fitness, goals, community. A man can now build an entire life without ever going on a date. That changes everything because once the alternative becomes good, relationships stop competing against loneliness. They start competing against what men want most: peace. A relationship is no longer competing against an empty apartment or a silent phone. It is competing against a Saturday morning workout, a group of close friends, a hobby he loves, financial freedom, a career he is proud of, a life he already enjoys. Giving all that up for someone is a much harder sell. When a man spends years hearing he is not tall enough, not strong enough, not successful enough, not attractive enough, simply not enough, over and over again, he steps away from dating and discovers he has more money, more time, less stress, fewer disappointments, and complete control over his own schedule. The question changes from why he left to why would he come back. The Stoic philosopher Musonius Rufus wrote that we should not let our fears stop us from doing what is right, but rather let reason guide our actions. Reason tells a man that a life he has built on his own terms is not something to trade lightly for a lottery ticket with terrible odds. The fifth reason is that the market already priced it in. If men were truly as desperate as the narrative suggests, companies built on male spending would be thriving. They are not. Bumble's paying users fell almost 10% in a year, total revenue down more than 7%. The company that owns Tinder watched its paying users peak around 11 million and now sit under 9. These apps were built on men. Men were the overwhelming share of paying users. The entire model was built on the assumption that men would keep paying to be seen. When men stopped spending, the industry started shrinking. Bumble, whose entire identity was built on women messaging first, had to walk that back and let men start the conversation. The founding promise they made was gone the moment the money was gone. Exit behavior also shows up on earnings reports. The men already voted with their wallets years before any video was made about it. The philosopher Seneca observed that it is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it. Men decided to stop wasting their money on a system that gave them nothing in return. Now comes the hardest part of the analysis, the question no one is really allowed to ask. It is about the other half of the room. There is a bias in psychology called the self-serving bias, one of the most replicated findings in the field. Barmester documented it cleanly in 1990. When something goes wrong, every human being tends to read their own part as circumstance and the other person's part as character. I was completely stressed. Look at all I had going on. But them, that's their character. They are just selfish. Everyone does this. Men do it. Women do it. Everyone does it. But a relationship survives that bias for one reason. Accountability runs in both directions. He looks at his half, she looks at hers, and the dynamic self-corrects. Over the last few decades, however, a culture was built where accountability only points one direction. Looking hard at male behavior is recognized as commentary. Looking hard at female behavior is labeled an attack. Misogyny, patriarchy, unacceptable. It is the same mirror, the same question. In one direction, it gets a TED Talk. In the other, it gets a label. That is the one-way mirror. It is not any one individual's fault. It is in the air everyone breathes. But pay attention to what this does to two people. If only one of them is ever asked to look at their own half, the other half never gets examined. And in the unexamined half, resentment grows quietly for years until one person leaves and the other swears they never saw it coming. The psychologist and philosopher William James wrote that the greatest discovery of any generation is that a human being can alter his life by altering his attitude. But that discovery only works when both people are willing to alter theirs. When one half of the room is told they need to change and the other half is told they are fine as they are, the system becomes unsustainable. The evidence for this cost is clear. Stevenson and Wolfers, through the National Bureau of Economic Research, tracked women's happiness across 35 years of widening freedom and options. They found it went down, both on its own terms and in comparison to men. In the 1970s, women reported being happier than men. By the 2000s, that flipped. More freedom, more options, yet less happiness. That is not because the freedom itself was bad. It is because no one handed women the other half of that deal. The part where more power and more freedom also come with more responsibility, more layers of accountability. Instead, the message was that standards could go up while self-examination could go down. No system survives that. The unexamined half will rot in anyone, male or female. So where does that leave us? It leaves us in a reality that no one really wants to acknowledge. Most men did not leave because they hate women. They left because they stopped believing their efforts would even matter. Hatred is emotional. This was arithmetic. Every relationship runs on the same exchange: effort for appreciation, investment for reciprocation, responsibility for influence. When one side feels responsible for everything and appreciated for nothing, eventually the math breaks. Once it breaks, people do not always leave dramatically. Sometimes they leave quietly. They stop approaching, stop pursuing, stop volunteering, stop explaining. Then one day everyone looks up and wonders where they went. The cruel irony is that the men women typically wanted most were the first ones capable of leaving. The disciplined, responsible men with options and character. These are the men who could build a life with or without a relationship. They looked at this market and realized the reward no longer justified the cost. So they directed their effort elsewhere. Once a man builds a life he finds deeply meaningful and truly enjoys, he becomes very difficult to motivate with promises, especially promises he no longer believes. The competition is not other women. The competition is the man's own life. The gym does not criticize him. His mission does not ghost him. His hobbies do not tell him he is inadequate. His friends do not make him earn basic respect. If the response to that observation is anger, the entire point has been missed. Anger is what happens when feedback feels like an attack. And feedback is exactly what this culture stopped allowing. The greatest lie ever sold to modern women was not that men are unnecessary. It was the idea that standards could rise forever while self-examination disappeared, that expectations could increase while accountability decreased, and that every disappointment was someone else's fault. Every failed relationship only has one side worth examining. No system survives that. No marriage survives that. No person survives that. The moment the ability to ask, "What was my part in this?" is lost, the ability to change anything is also lost. The men already told everyone why they left. The data was public. The warnings were public. The outcomes were public. None of this happened in secret. While everyone was busy analyzing men, judging men, criticizing men, correcting men, explaining men, many men simply stopped participating. Not because of the reasons women like to create for them, simply because they no longer saw a reason to participate. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus wrote that we should not seek to have events happen as we wish, but to wish them to happen as they do happen. Men learned to wish for the lives they could build on their own, and they built them. The good men did not disappear. They adapted. Adaptation is what people do when the truth stops working. They stopped showing up because the cost of showing up was too high and the reward was too low. They stopped chasing because chasing made them feel small. They stopped investing because investment without reciprocation is not love, it is a donation to someone else's self-esteem. And they stopped explaining because explanations that are never heard are just wasted breath. The conversation that could have fixed this was called an attack, so it never happened. And now the market is what it is. Women are wondering where all the good men went. The answer is simple. They are in the gym, in their businesses, with their friends, pursuing their passions, building lives that do not require anyone else's approval. They are not hiding. They are just no longer playing a game they cannot win. The question is not whether they will come back. The question is whether the game will change enough to make coming back worthwhile. If this video helped you in one way or another, please consider supporting the channel using the Super Thanks feature. Your support means a lot, and it helps us keep creating better content specially for you. Every contribution goes directly into improving the quality of these videos and bringing you more of the Stoic wisdom and psychological insights that you have come to expect. Thank you for being part of this journey. Stay grounded, stay present, and I will see you right here in the next one.